Ready, Felix?
Yes, I will give it a minute for people to join. Numbers are still growing, so let's wait a minute. Still growing. All right. Yes, Mark, please start the sharing and then, all right. And I guess then, hello everyone, good evening, good morning, or whatever time zone you're in. Today's AgriDance talk is on peatlands and greenhouse gases, insights and mitigation pathways from New Zealand, South Africa, and Germany. Yeah, what is AgriDance? The next slide, please, Mark. So my name is Felix Seidel. I'm from the German side of this project, from the Thun Institute. My counterpart and today's technical spokesperson is Mark Liefering, from the Ag Emissions Center in New Zealand. So what is AgriDance? It is an alliance for the climate. It's a dialogue on climate and agriculture between New Zealand and Germany. We try to foster mutual understanding, political, scientific, and technical cooperation, everything around the topics of agriculture and food systems in times of climate change. We do not only do scientific exchange, we also have a dialogue between policymakers and research, and we try to foster the exchange with third-party countries. The whole project is based on 4 pillars. We have one topic on farm-level greenhouse gas accounting, one on food loss and waste, then third-party countries engagement and livestock, and today we are in the 4th and maybe most important pillar, for me at least, the soil organic carbon in agricultural soils. So today's timeline, we have now the welcome from me and Mark, and then we will start with today Heidi van de Venter from the Agricultural Research Council in South Africa. Jason couldn't make it. He is in the field with no internet connection. Then we follow with New Zealand, where we have Jordan Goodrich and Louis Schipper, and we end up with Bärbel Thiemeyer from the Thun Institute in Germany. What is important is everybody speaks for about 15 minutes, and then we have a short 5-minute time for technical questions, just to foster understanding. You can, as the listener, you can write in the Q&A at the bottom your questions. These will be answered because in the end, we also have about 15 to 20 minutes for general discussion where we get into the questions which are more complex than a yes and no answer. The next slide is about housekeeping. So yes, all of you, you are muted and your videos are turned off and you ask questions via the Q&A button, as I just mentioned. I will moderate that and I will read out the questions, maybe sort them a little bit to have a nice mix that everybody can speak and not all questions go to one person. Yeah, in the end, there is some extra time for more questions. And in the end, the webinar that is being recorded will be uploaded to YouTube and you will get the link from the AgriDance website. And also I will send one last email after all the 4 workshops. So this is the 4th workshop of those we've been doing. So what's the next slide? I think the next slide is I'm done talking. So as you can see, this is not Jason Leroux. This is Heidi who is talking. We just had a little issue with the naming. It didn't work out with the change, but I think we can all agree that Heidi will do a good job, even if it is written Jason. So the floor is yours, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Felix. Yes, this is primarily a presentation by Dr. Jason Leroux from the Agricultural Research Council, but we have collaborated on some of the work. So Jason is a soil scientist and really the peatland expert, but I am Dr. Heidi van Deventer from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in the country, and my field of expertise is more geomatics and remote sensing. But we really had the fortunate opportunity to work together on South Africa's peatlands and try to assess the current state pressures, protection, and then I'll also be sharing some of his work on the new research that he's done. So you can see from this slide that El-Shahawi et al. In 2019 published the age of the different peatlands over time. So top left, only 3 of the peatlands are really very old, between 50 and 21,000 years old. And then another 9 is between 21 and 11,000 years old, and several additional ones are between 11 and 6,000. But the majority of the systems are very young, younger than 6,000 years. So some of the previous work that's been done was a sampling and a collation of peat points across the country that was sampled by different people. So they collected 635 points, and they collated that in a publication that's listed on the bottom right. And that's distributed across most of the provinces, but you can see the high density is on the East Coast, in the KwaZulu-Natal and the northern part of the Eastern Cape province, and along the coast on a coastal plain called the Maputoland Coastal Plain. Whereas in the Free State, one of the wetland specialists did a systematic organic sampling of 300 points, but we still don't know what's the representativity of points right across the country, and definitely additional funding and work is needed to better represent where all the soil types are. So in this paper, the 635 peat points were used to model possible ecoregion extent of where these systems may occur. So on the left-hand side, you'll see in the table the different attributes where data was available, geospatial data for the extent of South Africa, and a threshold is listed in the third column that was used to combine and model the peat ecoregions of South Africa. So it's rainfall, geology, slope, mean annual groundwater recharge, groundwater component of the river-based flow, and the depth to the groundwater level and springs. So the output was then this map showing possible extents of different types of peat ecoregions, and the correspondence with the existing 635 points was over 87%. So it could be a good model to use and consider if you need to sample for peat when you're working in these regions. So the initial project where we started working together was funded by the South African National Biodiversity Institute, or SANBI in short. They run the National Biodiversity Assessments approximately every 5 to 7 years, and the first one was done in 2004. But wetlands weren't included in that one. Subsequently, in 2011, we had to model some of the wetlands, and then we had the opportunity where I led the freshwater component of the most recent one in 2018. The period of time was between 2016 and 2019, and we included peatlands for the first time to assess their status and whether they're threatened or not. The definition that we've used as a reference was that one of Houston and Clark, 2002. And the initial finding from that report of the NBA 2018 was that 80% of the mapped peatlands were considered heavily to critically modified already. So mostly South Africa used a hydrogeomorphic approach for the wetlands. So whether we grouped it together, whether it's a floodplain, depression, valley bottom, or seep, and it was assessed that way. But the fact is that the peatlands is, even though it's substrate to these systems, we still want to understand whether it can be red listed as unique systems. So as a follow-up to the National Biodiversity Assessment, we worked on a journal paper that's listed on the right-hand side, where we tried to improve the mapping and the assessment that was done in the National Biodiversity Assessment. So that detailed journal paper found that we have only 121 and 128 hectares, which is a total of 0.1% of the whole of South Africa that's been mapped. In that paper, you would find the information on the summary statistics that was available, the information in the first bullet, but then also categorized according to the different peat regions. And we calculate that the average total carbon stock of the 16 peat ecoregions, there you can see the value in metric tons, also the carbon stock in how it varies across the peat ecoregions, the lowest in the Bushveld Basin, that's more on the plateau and inland, compared to the Natal coastal plain that I've showed on the eastern side in the KwaZulu-Natal province that has the highest amount of stock. Also, the accumulation rates varies over all these plains, but the Natal Coastal Plain peat ecoregion have the highest amount of 37,000 tons per year. And then it was also interesting to align it with the global biodiversity assessment, where they tried to distinguish how many of these are forested or non-forested, and only 10% of ours are forested according to our remote sensing models and maps, and meaning they can be considered as very unique and maybe range restricted in a red listing criteria. The pressures and impacts that we see on the South African wetlands are especially the changes to the hydrological regimes. 72% of the extent of South Africa is considered arid, and whereas the rest is mesic or more temperate in climate, and there's a small patch of a little bit of a subtropical region there in the Maputoland coastal plain bordering to Mozambique. So the abstraction of water from aquifers and interbasin transfer has a tremendous impact on the reduction of water levels. In addition, yes, we have water pollution, habitat transformation and clearing of peatland vegetation, peat extraction and agricultural farming historically was done on these systems. There is erosion and sedimentation. And because we are in a country with a lot of lightning, but also management of fire, we see the increase of peat fires becoming an issue. So here, for example, in the very arid western coast, there was a lot of potato farming. They even added orange farming in a system that cannot really manage it. And so the estuarine system and uplands parts of it started raining and becoming extremely dry in these areas to such a degree that there was a fire and the acidity was close to 2, a pH of 2. And then it becomes very difficult to manage it because there's not regularly a flash flood coming through and actually charging in the water, the groundwater table, resupplying the water table, or extinguishing some of the fires. Here is another example of forest plantations that's located on these peat systems, as well as indigenous farming in the center of the image, which can drain the system or at least cause disturbances. Sometimes if it's too wet, they add channels that ensure that the wetland is drained so that they can benefit from harvesting their crops or growing the crops and harvesting them in the build-up of that soil material. So draining it and not stopping it during the dry season can cause a desiccation of the system. Then we also have the invasive tree species that cause a lot of drainage of the water. And there's national and citizen science that actually intervene and try to keep these cut down the invasive tree species, but it doesn't always occur everywhere. And peatlands aren't necessarily locally accessible or easy to clean. Here is an example of a peat fire. So we're not sure if it was caused by lightning or whether it was uncontrolled management of fields being burned or somebody vandalizing and setting it afire. But it burned for quite some time. They had to evacuate a school close by. And it really is one of the challenges. So this was based in the Western Cape, but we have other examples also in the country. So as part of the journal paper that I've mentioned and where Jason and I worked together, we started grafting this graph that shows, do we see an increase in the peat fires? So on the left-hand side, you'll see it's the rainfall is indicated with the blue graph, typically a very seasonal system with annual changes for the whole country. Yes, we have a bit of Mediterranean around the Cape, but the rest of the system is receiving summer rainfalls. Then the two orange columns are where we have our most extreme droughts. The one of 1992 to 1995 was extreme and long in duration and very extensive in the country. Whereas if you look on the right, you'll see that the one of 2015 to 2016 wasn't even more than a year and apparently haven't affected the same extent in the country compared to the previous extreme drought. Then the points indicate the extent in hectares of the area that are burned, and the shape is indicating in which ecoregion do they occur. And so just visually, you can compare the time or the number that you see between the two droughts is fewer compared to those on the right-hand side. And what got documented better is the duration of the drought that's indicated by the red horizontal bars. So in summary, we found and argued that it's more about anthropogenic pressures as opposed to climate change because of the increase in the number of extraction of people in these basins and land use that may have increased potentially the number and the duration of these peat fires. 49 peat sites have burned in the past 5 years compared. Sorry, I can't see the screen. Let me just try and move it. Is it 23? In the past, sorry, I can't see that properly, in the 24-year period preceding it. And the total loss was estimated to equate to 280 tons to date. So it's an increasing problem. The location of these 51 sites across 21 peatlands, so different parts of a peatland, can burn 67% of the sites are on the Natal coastal plain in map B, so that you can see the zoom in version of this. 7 sites in the Western Cape province and the remaining 10 on the inland plateau in the Highveld. The deepest burn was 7 meters in Bodibe, that's the wetland name in the Northwest province, so around about here. And the average depth, let me just try and move this, I can't see, 1.3 meters. And I've mentioned the carbon loss, and obviously this result in then carbon dioxide emissions occurring. One of the fantastic interventions that someone from the Working for Fire team that's as part of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment invented this spout with multiple exit points where you can actually, under pressure, inject this into the substrate and then the water actually distributes. So this is at the ONRIS one. It is a journal paper, or it's a popular article that everybody can access and share with other people. And it was amazing. They also used remote sensing and thermal imagery to determine where would it be safe to actually access the system and inject water. But isn't it absolutely absurd that we as humans are extracting more than what we should do and then risking other people's lives in sending them in a very risky environment, because it can also collapse where you step before you can inject water back into the system. So we should really develop better remote sensing monitoring systems that can actually detect this so that we can have early intervention in issuing water licenses. Now, the challenges that we have in South Africa is that the wetlands are extremely small and narrow in extent. You know, elsewhere in more tropical countries or Europe, they're wide and extensive. But for us, it's really a challenge. What's not a challenge is that we don't have forested wetlands predominantly in these systems. So we should be able to develop better remote sensing monitoring systems. So some of the previous soil moisture monitoring is around about, I think, 10 kilometers. That's too wide. For that, spatial resolution doesn't work for our systems. But the capabilities of Sentinel-1 and 2 at a 10-meter spatial resolution is definitely something that can be investigated. There's numerous indices for soil moisture monitoring. But the question is, can we actually monitor the subsidence of the groundwater table accurately? We need to determine how accurate we can do that. Here's another example. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you see Lake Sibayi. That's our largest freshwater lake in the country, located on the KwaZulu-Natal coastline, if you want to go and Google it. Then you see north of it, there's a number of plantations, such as the Mazingenya plantation. And in between in that circle is the location of the Vazi Pan that is zoomed in on the left-hand side. And the extent that is burned was 266 hectares. And Jason added quite a number of photographs because that was part of his PhD. And here, for example, there's Jason Leroux standing on the edge of Vazi Pan, where he said the water level used to be only 1 meter below the surface ground, and now he's measuring it 6.5 meters deep. So that is a significant change as a result of the forest plantations in a coastal plain that's extremely groundwater driven and very sandy. And so it's very logical that the water licenses need to be re-evaluated, and that process is now ongoing. So this is the result of the burn. You can see it formed a tremendous crust So if you walk on the crust, it's relatively safe. In between, there is erosion in the cracks, and the material is eroding towards the cracks, and it's not always wet. So here is one example where he's illustrating the crust at the top. You can walk, but in between, you get that gravel that's accumulating by gravity and by if it's inundated or any rain. There is more or less the depth of the damage that you can see. That's another example, which I forgot what he wanted me to say about that one. Apologies. But he did show then lastly, you can see just the top part is eroded material. It's completely burned. It's like charcoal that's just eroding into the system and not considered peat anymore. And yeah, we don't know how it will be restored and if it will be restored at all. And to the deeper layers, you can see the peat is more intact. And so maybe there is potential if the upper parts actually erode and gets crusty, that part needs to remain intact, but that's dependent on the water levels that needs to be revised. On the left-hand side, again, just the crust and the burnt and the change in the soil types. And then as part of his PhD, he analyzed the pH and was wondering what is the pH across a transect from the west to the east. You can see that slight tilt also of the coastal plain towards the Indian Ocean on the east. But the pH is extremely acidic in the center of the system, whereas you have that groundwater pushing up on the edges closer to the dunes where it is increasing. But this is very troublesome and problematic. He even kept this slide. He asked me, maybe we should delete it. I said, no, because on the right-hand side, the aluminium was actually damaged by the sulfuric acid of the sample that he was trying to measure. Here is a little bit of rain that the system got, and you can see the cracks are being filled. There's a lot of trampling still by cattle. You can see maybe some of the cattle in this rural area. I don't know if they're really contributing to maybe trample through these parts, but the acidity would be very dangerous. And more recently in this year, there was a lot of rain, and very likely the acidity was diluted. And it is a possible natural way of restoration of the system. Another fact is one cannot actually buy offsets, wetland offsets for peatlands in South Africa if there's only 0.1% of the extent. And so these are unique systems that should be carefully managed. And fortunately, they are reviewing the water licenses, but whether that change and natural restoration would take place and whether we can report it to the Global Biodiversity Framework by 2030 is unknown. But thank you very much. Here's Jason and my email addresses if you would want to contact us. And while we're having questions, I'm going to play this drone image of the Vazipan that we visited right about 2022, just showing you the extent of the burned area that gets burned again with lightning. And this is not where you can get the fire brigade to come in and just fix the whole system. All right, hope that was interesting for you.
Thank you, Heidi. Very nice, very impressive pictures. And we also have some questions. The first question from Simon Guerrero, I would actually like to push later to the discussion part, as this is something where everybody could answer from the speakers. So we'll go to Trevor Richards first. Have you been able to measure the quantity, carbon content, and stability of the resulting carbon after the fires?
I wouldn't know if Jason have done it. I'm going to relay the question to him. And yeah, if you can maybe just put it in the chat for me, then I can try and push it to Jason for WhatsApp. But I'm not sure if he's done it as part of his PhD at the University of the Free State and whether you can access and download that and just see. But would you mind putting it in the chat for me? Then I can ping him on WhatsApp and see if he can answer.
Yes, I will make sure that happens. And then there's one more. Thank you, Heidi, for the presentation. Are there discussions in South Africa to re-wet drained peatland? And if yes, are there incentive systems provided by public or private institutions?
Yeah, I think most of the land is owned by government and it's their responsibility as under the Department of Water and Sanitation and Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment to address it and ensure the water licenses are in place. But most of it has been very reactive to point. So when it burns, then only they consider how can we restore it. So the onerous example in the Western Cape is the first where they actively went to inject that water in substrate in order to reduce the emissions. But this one, there was no intervention or reaction. As I said, they're just reviewing the water licenses. But the other ones were basically left. And so it becomes a little bit of a challenge to take it up with both of the government organizations to ensure that the intervention happens fast enough. Even in Verloren Valley Ramsar site, the one that I've shown first in the Western Cape, that affects the estuarine system, and that acidity affects the estuarine species that comes into breed also during certain seasons. So very reactive. We don't have a proper wetland monitoring system also in place. So yes, there are a number of efforts, but the funding is lacking to really ensure that we have an operational system that could ensure that we constantly monitor the systems in order to do preventive and early reaction of these groundwater dependent ecosystems. I hope that answers the question.
I think so, yes. And in terms of timekeeping, the other questions, Heidi, either you can answer them now during the next talks or we discuss them later in the last part. So thank you for your talk. And
Excellent.
now
Thank you
we,
so much.
all right, and now we continue. We move to New Zealand. I think Louis, you will share the slides. And yeah, I can see your screen. And this is not the presenter mode. This is the presenter mode, so we can see your next slide. If you could adjust that. Perfect. But if I'm correctly informed, Jordan, you will do the talking, yes?
Yes.
All right, then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felix. Yes, so my name is Jordan Goodrich from the New Zealand Bioeconomy Science Institute. I'll be presenting on some of the work that we've been doing here in New Zealand with the aim of improving greenhouse gas outcomes from drained peat. First, I'd like to recognize Louis Schipper from Waikato University, and I'll be handing over to him for the second half of the presentation. And he's going to talk about some of the projects that are either just underway or about to kick off. But I also want to acknowledge that Jack Pronger has been leading much of the work that we'll be talking about as well. So if we go to the next slide. Yep. So I want to start by just giving some context and a sense of scale for the peatland issues in New Zealand, starting with area. So peatlands cover about 1% of New Zealand, and most of that is concentrated in a few regions, particularly here in the Waikato, where Louis and I and Jack are based. And that's highlighted here in the inset map. So about 80% of historical peatland area has been drained. And most of that drainage was done to develop land for agricultural uses. So you can see that clearly here, where the dark red color is intact peatlands and the light green and sort of tan colors represent drained agricultural peatlands. But before we get into issues we face with drained peatlands, it's worth just briefly introducing New Zealand's peatlands in their natural state, given they're globally unique for a couple of reasons. Number one, these are not sphagnum-dominated systems, so it's too warm and dry here for sphagnum to persist over large areas. The main peat-forming vegetation is called Empedisma robustum, and this is a sort of short-statured vascular plant. And Empedisma is quite special in its ability to strongly limit evaporation. And this is what has allowed it to maintain relatively high rates of annual peat accumulation. So these ecosystems have been providing a very stable greenhouse gas sink for thousands of years. Now moving on to drained peatlands and their associated emissions. Again, roughly 80% of peatlands in New Zealand have been drained, and the majority of that land is used for intensive dairy production. So in these drained areas, the water tables are typically kept more than a meter below the surface for most of the year. And that allows large herds of 200 or 300 cows to graze for short intervals. So any given paddock will be grazed every couple of weeks or so during peak growing season. Now, what does that mean for emissions? Well, despite making up a very small area, the contribution of drained peatlands or organic soils is substantial. So we've recently updated national estimates using the IPCC wetland supplement guidelines. And we found emissions of nearly 4 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And that's roughly 6 or 7% of New Zealand's total net emissions using the most recent inventory numbers. So not surprisingly, most of the emissions are from grasslands. And while the estimates I'm showing in the figure were derived from default emission factors, we do have some limited at ecovariance flux measurements from drained peatlands in dairy pastures. And that was thanks to work largely led by Dave Campbell as part of the Peatwise program. And those measurements are more or less consistent with the grassland CO2 numbers from the wetland supplement. However, what they did show is that there's considerable variability in the annual CO2 emissions, and we really don't have enough data yet to develop our own country-specific emission factors. So if we break down those annual numbers by greenhouse gas, the problem is even more clearly defined. So we know grasslands are the primary contributing land use, but this also shows the vast majority of emissions within that are from CO2. And that's coming from the organic matter mineralization due to exposing that previously inundated peat. And just a note here that none of the emissions estimates include the animals on the land. So these are just the numbers from land-based emissions. So in the last couple of years, we've done some work to start improving the activity data we use for our inventory estimates. And that's largely been about refining both the national extent of peatland area and their associated nutrient status. And that's allowed us to generate those sort of default estimates and kind of get a sense of the problem, which we now recognize is quite massive. So now I'm going to hand over to Louis, and he's going to talk about some of the work we're just getting up and running to refine our understanding and look at how we can actually mitigate those emissions.
Thanks very much, Jordan. Yes, hello, everybody. My name is Louis Schipper. I'm at the University of Waikato, and we have a series of programs together with Manaki Whenua, so Jordan and co, looking at ways of potentially reducing emissions from drained peat soil. So I'll talk a little bit about those. They basically cover looking at how we might manage the water table to reduce emissions, reducing emissions from cropping systems, and whether lower intensity farming operations like some beef places that we've been looking at might reduce emissions, and then also looking at possible retirement of land and passive restoration. Just to give you a little bit of a background as to how we go about doing these measurements, many of you will be familiar with this. This is an eddy covariance tower, but if you're not, this kind of an approach allows you to constantly measure CO2 exchange at hectare scales for many years in a row. So you really are now looking at emissions, carbon balances when you do them correctly at paddock to farm scales and over annual time scales. And this is something that we've used extensively on mineral soils under agriculture and now shifting more to peat soils. So I'm going to talk you through 3 programs that we have underway and then bring them all together to show you how they link. The first one here is MAPSIS. This is with our Irish friends and colleagues. It's been going for a couple of years now. And what we're doing there is we are measuring the emissions from a natural peatland in New Zealand, which basically gives us the baseline of what these systems used to do. That has been measured now for about the last 12 years, led by Dave Campbell. And then we've also got 2 towers on deep and shallow drained peat, both under dairy farming. And the objective here is really to demonstrate what people have observed overseas, that you get larger emissions from more deeply drained peatlands. And this is something that we need to confirm. So it's an initial foray into sort of trying to quantify the size of these emissions associated with different water table depths. This is linked to modelling that is being done in Ireland and also here, using several different models to try and find the best ones, and then to adapt them to New Zealand conditions so that we can ultimately get to Tier 3 reporting in the longer term. The second program then is the REDOS program, and this is perhaps a little bit more focused on potential mitigation type strategies. And we're looking to reduce emissions by managing, or looking at, in the first instance, the changes in the emissions in more detail as water table is close to the surface. So the MAPS's project is just looking at, does deep versus shallow matter? And then coupled with this program here, we're looking to try and quantify the relationship between water table depth and emissions, so that we can think about managing water table to reduce emissions. We believe that in New Zealand that cropping practices, such as on the right there, such as maize production, will have relatively large emissions, or larger perhaps than pasture. And this is something that we need to determine, and then determine whether there are alternative approaches which we can reduce the emissions while still being able to crop. And then we're going to take advantage of a natural experiment where on the lower right-hand side, you'll see an aerial photograph of a paddock which has been retired by farmers because the land was just not profitable enough. It wasn't productive enough. And is now revegetating into semi-natural vegetation. And we want to look at what the carbon balance of those systems might be. The last program in this mitigation portfolio is with Waikato Regional Council, which is a local authority here where we work and where many of the peatlands are. And they are going to support us to be able to look at a couple of questions. One is whether we can actually raise water tables practically. And then does that actually reduce in greenhouse gas emissions? Overseas evidence might suggest, yes, we need to look in our unique system as to what that might be. And then we want to also look at whether there are other tillage approaches during crop establishment that might reduce emissions. Now, it is absolutely critical that we coordinate these programs, and they have been designed to be hand in glove with one another. The questions are on the left-hand side that I've just gone through, and on the right-hand side is a conceptualization of the work that we are doing, where at the top we've got a fully restored wetland, or perhaps a pristine wetland, such as Kupuatai, which I mentioned in the MAPS's program, where we've been monitoring for 12 years. And right at the bottom there, we have a drained peatland with relatively high emissions because perhaps the water table is deep or the cropping is intensive. And we're trying to move from the bottom potentially to the top, although perhaps we want to maintain production in some of these systems as well. And so we're trying to understand whether we can raise and to what degree we can raise water tables and the impact that has on greenhouse gas emissions, reducing emissions from cropping systems and land retirement. So what progress have we made so far? Same diagram here. The green hexagon there is where we have installed these eddy covariance towers, so we'll be able to measure full carbon balances on them in a very deep and a shallow drained dairy pasture. And then we've got that tower that's been running at Kupuatai for 12 years. That's funded out of the MAPS's project. The REDOS project, which is funded out of Ag Emissions, formerly known as New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Centre, will fill in the gaps between the very deep and shallow water tables. So now we'll have 6 sites of different water table depths under dairying. And then moving towards the left there, we'll be establishing towers looking at ways of reducing emissions from cropping. We put in a couple of towers there looking at maize at the moment. Then we've got a tower looking at whether systems with lower stocking rates might have lowered emissions. And then lastly, that land retirement, all within the REDOS project. Waikato Regional Council will be adding a couple of towers, or will add a couple of towers in there as well, looking at the reduced cropping and whether we can look at other land uses or raising water tables. In terms of progress that we've made, there are all the ticks here. These are the towers that have been installed. I think we're kind of on track to what we want to do. We've got to install another 5 to 6 towers in the next 6 months, but I think we're on track to do that. And then we'll have carbon balances for all these systems. So with that, I'll wrap up. Just to remind you, as Jordan said, peat covers a small proportion of New Zealand, perhaps greater than South Africa, but produces a very large contribution of greenhouse gases. And that doesn't include the animals on the land. We've got planned and current research underway, improving the inventory so we know what our target is, and starting work on identifying different mitigation strategies. In the future, we're going to have to think about measurements in other regions. In Southland, bottom of South Island of New Zealand, we really have to tackle this question of if we how can we raise water tables if they're going to reduce emissions? And then if there's going to be land that's going to be retired, are there pathways to restoration where we can go back to functioning peatlands? With that, we're working with a lot of people and a lot of different funders and organisations, and very grateful to all of them. Thank you. Felix.
All right. Thank you for this talk, Jordan and Louis. There are a few questions already. Looking at the time, we have 3 minutes. I will go with the brief ones. Are there discussions in New Zealand to use re-wetted peatlands for paludiculture?
That's certainly something of interest, and a number of groups have talked about the potential for paludiculture. I'm not aware of any as yet really taking off.
And then another brief question. Which greenhouse gases are the eddy towers measuring, CO2 and CH4?
So we are doing CO2 at all of them. We will be measuring methane at 3 of them, although there are some concerns about being able to measure methane from using eddy covariance in dairy systems, even if the cows are quite a long way away. And at 2 of the towers, we will be measuring nitrous oxide, also using the eddy covariance approach.
All right, thank you. There is one more question for you, which is quite long, so I leave that for either you answer it later or in the discussion. And now I would suggest we move on to Bärbel. So thank you again, Jordan and Louis. And now we will have Bärbel Thiemeyer from Germany, from the Thun Institute.
Yes, thank you. I will try to share the correct screen. What are you seeing?
We see everything correctly. You did well. The floor is yours.
Well, 50% chance. Okay, thank you for the invitation. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I will talk briefly a bit on greenhouse gas emissions from German organic soils, and I will focus on intensive dairy farming, because in the discussion with New Zealand colleagues, we found that it is a bit of a common interest, and there's lots of greenhouse gas research in Germany going on, and as there are only 15 minutes, I had to choose a focus. So it's intensive grasslands. In Germany, we have around 1.9 million hectares of organic soils, of which most of them are used for agriculture. And as you can see in the map, the peatlands are centered in northern Germany and in the pre-alpine region. And the federal state of Lower Saxony in the northwest, where also the Thünen Institute is located, is fittingly the most peatland-rich states. Most of our peatlands are fan peatlands, light green in this figure, but there are also some nutrient-poor box systems, mostly in northwestern Germany again. And we also did quite well in disturbing the profile of the peatlands. So some of the peats are covered with sand or other material, or so strongly degraded that there are somewhere in between peatlands and mineral soils. Regarding land use, most of it is agriculture, and most of the agriculture is grassland. We also have some forestry, some restored or not used peatlands, and also some remaining peat extraction. And not surprisingly, this results in major greenhouse gas emissions of around 50 million tons CO2 equivalents per year, according to our national inventory report. We made some adaptations lately, so the numbers change according to weather conditions from year to year. And this is also the major source of emissions from agriculture and agriculturally used soils. As in New Zealand, we also end up with around 7% of our total emissions. We also, of course, have some mitigation targets. We have a Climate Change Act, which requires us to have a net sink of minus 25 million tons of CO2 equivalents in 5 years. Which is nearly not achievable due to LULUCF being a very large source at the moment. And we have also an agreement between the federal states and the federal government on climate protection by peatland protection, which requires us to reduce the peatland emissions by around 10% until 2030. Germany is, as you might know, a federal country, so most of the action is done by the federal states, although there are also some upcoming national programs on raising water levels. Grassland is, however, not as homogeneous as this figure of the intensive grassland might suggest. And we evaluated remote sensing data of the number of cuts on grassland. So you can see that we have everything from non or very extensively used grasslands to very intensive systems. And we also evaluated the standard gross margin for grasslands. This has been done on a community level and then aggregated to the districts. So each point in this data set is a peatland-rich district and peatland weighted average standard gross margin. So basically, there are some districts where farmers really earn a lot of money with using grasslands, and in others it's a low intensity use, mainly by grazing. And we also, at the same districts, evaluated how much of the grassland is actually on organic soils. So you can imagine if there is a district where only 10% of the grassland is on organic soils, there are relatively easy options for farmers to be able to move elsewhere. On the other hand, if more than 50% of the grassland is done on organic soils, there are not many options. And when it comes to dairy farming, of course, we are on the high intensity side of the spectrum of grassland use, and also by the more higher standard gross margin, so it's a more profitable system. But this is also happening in these areas where we have a higher share organic soils in grassland use. So not many options to move elsewhere. So this is a problem we are facing mainly in northwestern Germany, but also in some of the pre-alpine regions. First of all, of course, people think whether it's possible to use sand covers or do anything without changing the water level, which of course would decrease CO2 emissions. It has been done in the past to improve trafficability, and I will only spend this one slide on it, comparing different data on CO2 emissions with and without sand cover, and it shows rather nicely that there is not really an effect of having a sand cover while draining, having still deeply drained peatlands. Therefore, something needs to be done on raising the water levels, and the traditional way of doing it is blocking ditches. But this is hard, is difficult to really control the water level in the field. The field will be relatively wet in spring, so there will be no fertilization early in the year, a delayed late harvest, and so on. So the Dutch colleagues came up with the idea of subsurface irrigation. So the ditches are blocked, or even there is pumped water into the ditches, and you have narrow pipes which infiltrate water into the fields and drain it again in winter. So in the ideal world, you would have water levels which are about 30 centimeters below ground, more or less all year round, which allows for trafficability in spring but increases water level in summer. This is an experiment we had done a couple of years ago, where in very dry years we thought, yes, hydrologically, this is working very well. We can increase the water levels by this technique while the reference site dries out quite a bit. In this case, the farmers also quite liked it because of the drought in these years. The yield of this subsurface irrigation system, SI, could not only be stabilized but also increased compared to the drought systems, and also compared to the problems which ensued with the drought with maize. In wetter years, yields are quite similar. So, but there are other studies out, and before we talk about greenhouse gas effects, we need to ensure that there is a water level effect of this system. And I compiled all studies I could find on subsurface irrigation with paired sites, and compared the mean annual water level of the control site and the mean annual water level raised by subsurface irrigation, and put a one-to-one line into this figure with a 5 centimeter margin, because as you might know, measuring water levels in peatlands exactly is not that easy due to ground surface movement, heterogeneity, and so on. So everything within this gray bar is treated as no effect on the water levels. So you can see that there are quite a few sites, and especially those which have been very dry in the control situation, where the water level could be raised quite a bit by the subsurface irrigation. But there are also other sites where there's no effect, or where there is actually a drainage effect. And this might be due to technical failures, to too low ditch water levels, to drainage in winter, and to the properties of the peat, low hydraulic conductivities, or the drainage of infiltrating groundwater, which has been led away. So yes, in quite a few cases, it works hydrologically. And now we will have a look on the CO2 emissions. These are the same studies. I excluded data where grassland renovation has lately been taken place. And you can see quite a few things, and quite a few things are surprising. There's a huge range of CO2 emissions from uptakes, even in a drained situation, which has been reported by some authors, to very high emissions. But you can also see that if you have wetter conditions due to the subsurface irrigation, that the effects differ between increase and decrease of emissions due to the change of the vegetation composition. But you can also see up here that you have increased emissions despite higher water levels. And we think that in this case, this might be that we changed the topsoil conditions from moisture limited conditions to optimum moisture. So if we compare this data with a lab study where you can see a nice response to water filled pore space of the CO2 fluxes, that you have an optimal conditions for respiration somewhere at 80% water filled pore space. So it can actually be too dry in the upper horizons. And there might be also differences between bog and fan peat because the degradation signature between these peat types differs. If we go to bog systems, we often see that only the topsoil is strongly degraded. This moves, of course, downward, but the subsoil, even though it's aerated, has still well-conserved peat within it. So the topsoil matters in these systems, and this can move from too dry to optimal conditions. And we also have situations here where we have no change in water levels, but still there were decreased emissions reported. Due to this strong range in absolute emissions, which might be to soil conditions, to land use history, also to measurement techniques. I decided to work with percentage emission reductions because the measurement techniques and of course land use history were the same in the paired studies themselves, and I aggregated all data. So this is the percentage change in CO2 emissions of all these grassland systems, most of them used for intensive dairy farming, and the mean change in mean annual water level. And again, the gray bar is this 5 centimeters in mean annual water level change, where I think that measurements, exact quantifications of the water level are difficult. What you can see here is, first of all, bog peat in dark green and fan peat in light green, and also quite a scatter of the data. We have a tendency of a change in of a decrease in CO2 emissions with water levels, but there are also this increased emissions, which I explained, and some very weird effects where you have no change in water levels at all, but a reported change in CO2 emissions by 40%. So I think there is some more digging into data needed to really understand what causes the system to react that differently. And for sure, it's not a safe measure to really reduce emissions. So far, I've been talking about CO2 only. I will briefly say a few words about N2O, which we focused on in the Gnarrenburger Moor, one of our sites, where we have measure CO2 with eddy covariance and N2O with chambers. We have a control site and a field scales trial and subsurface irrigation. And in the first year, there was a grassland renewal being done. This is a regular practice by many grassland farmers, because after a few years, the surface becomes uneven and there are unwanted grasses. And we saw really huge increases of N2O emissions, about 50 ton CO2 equivalents after the grassland renewal combined with increased water levels. Methane is nowhere an issue. After time, this might reduce, but in the end, we will have, with increased water level, unwanted grasses such as Juncus effusus again, and farmers would want to have another grassland renewal. So we might be again at the N2O problem. So after 6 years, we see indeed that the N2O emissions decrease, but remain at a rather high level. Overall, there is a decrease in CO2 emissions, but after there are also years where there is no difference in CO2 emissions, and after 6 years, the summed up emissions of the subsurface irrigations are still higher than of the reference site. So to conclude with, sand cover without raised water levels does show limited effects on emissions, and the effects of sub-irrigation systems are hard to predict. The effects of water levels are very site-specific, and so are the effects on CO2 emissions, but the effects do not necessarily match. And we are still not at the point where we can really conclude on the data from different authors and different sites. Effects of N2O emissions and also midterm fodder quality need to be considered before concluding on these systems. And the implementation of sub-irrigation relies on detailed water management of the water levels in ditches. And there, Germany and the Netherlands have a very different tradition and also very different implementation of these water management systems. Drainage in winter also means loss of water for summer and for groundwater recharge. So especially for bog peat, subsurface irrigation is, in my opinion, no solution for intensive dairy farming. So there seems to be only the way out to move dairy farming to exchange land, but not to raise the water levels with the effect of decreased fodder quality and, if so, marginal effects on greenhouse gas emissions at the field scale. So with this, I would like to thank you, and I'm curious for the discussion.
Thank you, Bärbel, for your talk. So right now there's no direct question to you. Then back to the audience. If you have questions, just type it in the Q&A field. And then I would just start with the first questions here, and we see where the discussion leads us. And I would like to start with the very first question we had today, and this goes to everyone, but I would just say maybe we start with Jordan and Louis, and then the others can answer. So the question is, what are your views of the emerging trend of using peatland for rice cultivation, in this case in Northwest Europe? There are a few big projects where cultivating rice as a restoration practice, since it would have re-irrigation as a solution to restore, mitigate greenhouse gas, and also have a useful combined strategy.
That's not something that we have in New Zealand, and so it's not something that I've given any thought to. Yeah, I could speculate, but I think that would not be appropriate.
All right, then maybe Bärbel, do you have an opinion on this?
Well, I know that in Switzerland there are some trials with rice on peatlands ongoing, and I'm really watching this closely because I'm curious where it leads us. because of course there are methane issues and so on. It's a relatively high intensity system. In Germany, so far, there are no trials with rice, but there are trials with rice on mineral soils, as far as I know. But we are watching our southern neighbors very closely on where it leads us.
All right. Heidi, would you like to add?
Sorry, I missed the question. Would you mind repeating?
Yeah, I'm actually unsure if this is relevant for your region. It's about rice cultivation, and do you think
Right.
this could be a restoration practice since it has the re-irrigation as a solution to restore and to mitigate greenhouse gases? Do you think this would be
Yeah,
something
so
useful?
we don't have rice cultivation in South Africa in the peatlands. It's predominantly, small communities that would and are very dependent on these systems to actually do their local crops. And there are a number of training courses where people go out and help them to say, if you're not cultivating, just ensure that you block that you don't drain the system. And also in the Mfolosi floodplain, there's been sugarcane cultivation for more than 100 years. And that's a very challenging situation between all the different farmers and communities and the conservation agencies. I do want to add that we do have a few flux towers up in the country now within the past 3 years, but they're not all located in the peatlands. So it remains a challenging situation, and also because of accessibility. The Isimangaliso Wetland Park and Ramsar site is a massive system on that KwaZulu-Natal coastal plain, but it's extremely dangerous because of the mammals such as your hippo, buffalo, crocodile, to actually enter and being able to monitor those systems. And with remote sensing, it becomes challenging to actually be able to penetrate through the canopy in order to understand what is happening underneath the canopy. But what we have done in another paper where we called it the conservation conundrum is we've proved that some of the forested wetlands on those peatlands are converted to banana plantations even inside the protected areas. So those are the challenges that we have. We don't have the rice farming, but again, it's extremely challenging to do that monitoring of the gas flux. And yeah, for me, the answer is that we need to persist with remote sensing, spaceborne or even airborne if possible, because even drones are becoming quite difficult on the coast with the wind factor. And then also, if you lose your drone in the forested wetland, you're not going to go and retrieve it between the buffalo, or the big five. No, okay.
Thank you. Then let's move to a question to New Zealand. I will sum it up a little bit. As we know, drained peatlands are significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, largely due to microbially mediated processes in the soil. These emissions are a known concern, but it is also clear that the most soil-emitted greenhouse gases arise from complex microbial pathways. Given this, what is your opinion on using soil amendments like basic slag or fly ash to increase sulfate ion concentrations as a strategy to suppress methanogenesis through sulfate-reducing bacteria competition? Maybe let's start with this. There's a bit more.
Yep. So sulfate will obviously inhibit methanogens. The work that we've done on the New Zealand peatlands, and I think may well be similar in other parts of the world, the majority of the emissions from the drain peatlands of concern are CO2 rather than methane. And nitrous oxide, as Barbel has shown, it's certainly going to be up there as well. But methane has been less of a concern to us. I believe that much of the methane in drained peat soils can be emitted from the ditches. And I don't think that I'd want to be putting sulfur-containing compounds into the ditches that could drain somewhere. So I think I'd be pretty cautious about doing something like that.
I see some nodding from Heidi. Would you like to add to this?
Yeah, my first thought with that was what is the cost of that, and how effective would that be in rural areas where you also have the cattle going in? You know, for me, sorry, I'm a bit biased in thinking the first thing is to remove the forest plantations and see if you can actually recover the groundwater to the correct level. But whether that will be sustained over South Africa's irregular rainfall, and we have general wet and dry years, they are not consistent in the groundwater dependent ecosystems or in those groundwater regions. So I would rather vote and nominate for water management as the top priority before you have to fund and purchase additional substrate to add to a system. And yes, the runoff to other areas and the impacts can be a concern. Yeah.
All right. Anyone else want to add to this? All right. Then I would ask a question to Bärbel. I'm missing your voice. You get 2 questions. Let's start with the first one. I explored peatland scarcity and the search for suitable peat alternatives. Given the current discussions in Europe about the environmental impact of peat extraction and use, what specific mitigation measures are being implemented in Germany to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from organic soils used in intensive dairy farming?
Well, these are 2 topics. I mean, there is a peat extraction issue going on, and we still have peat extraction in Germany. It will phase out at some point, but there's, of course, still the peat use, so we export the problem to other countries. So I think there is a European solution needed, which is at the moment not in the focus of discussions. Regarding intensive dairy farming, at the moment there are no measures to be implemented. There are political programs, so via the CAP funding on ditch blocking, but this is mainly used for low intensity systems such as grazing, because for intensive dairy farming, ditch blocking, if it works properly, creates conditions which are too wet in spring to allow for intensive dairy farming, and also will impact the fodder quality. So at the moment, there is no real solution for intensive dairy farming.
Thank you. Following up on this, how are German agricultural policies addressing the trade-off between maintaining productive grassland for dairy farming and restoring or re-wetting organic soils to lower emissions?
Well, that's a difficult one or a complex one. At the moment, let's start with our mitigation targets. At the moment, we are having a mitigation target which proposes a LULUCF sink. And LULUCF is, well, composed of mainly the forest sink, which is at the moment in Germany no sink anymore, and the peatland source. Of course, also on all carbon stock changes in mineral soils, but I leave it out at the moment. So we have the demand of a strong source here. At the same time, we have this 10% reduction target for peatland emissions. So in a way, as we say, we have a 10% emission reduction target. This can be reached theoretically without touching the intensive dairy regions at all, because it's only 10%. But this 10% is not enough to reach the LULUCF targets. So there is obviously a discrepancy which has not been yet addressed. We have we have these funding lines for ditch blocking, which I mentioned, which are in the respective federal states quite popular. And we hope for upcoming funding lines for paludiculture, which we hope will come out this year, which is for full rewetting. Whether this is a viable alternative for grassland farming remains to be seen. Personally, I think for these regions, the only way is to have structured land swap programs, so that that grassland farming can continue on mineral soils, and there's rewetting, complete rewetting in the organic soils. But this is, of course, an enormous effort, and also quite socially quite demanding, and I don't see it coming in the next years.
Thank you. Maybe I would like to also ask this question to Team New Zealand, because you also have productive grasslands, but the question is, are they also on organic soils, and how is it for you? Maybe one of you could answer.
Jordan,
Well, I would say
answer that.
at the moment, it's not necessarily being addressed, not through, you know, policy initiatives. This problem of you know, needing to reduce emissions while contending with the idea of maintaining or potentially sacrificing production, because a lot of these areas are quite economically lucrative. So that's a really challenging problem. On the other hand, some of the areas used for dairying on peatlands or drained organic soils are becoming very difficult to manage because they're in sort of lower lying areas. And as the ground continues to subside, those farmers in those areas are dealing with, you know, flooding issues for large parts of the year. And so for a subset of farmers on drained organic soils here, they're starting to look for alternatives or starting to abandon area, like, you know, specific areas of their farms. And so that's where we kind of see an opportunity to start exploring other options for how, you know, how you might change management or you know, manipulate water table, things like that.
And the social tensions there are pretty large as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as Barbara has said, that these are the sorts of things that are going to take some time to work our way through.
Mm.
All right, thank you. Then I would like to hear Heidi again. There's a question for you. How do South African peatlands compare to those in other African countries in terms of vulnerability to climate change?
I saw that question and I thought that is a bit difficult to answer because I think up in Africa, there has been an African inventory as part of the Global Peatlands Atlas. And in that chapter, we've indicated that we don't think all the wetlands and the peatlands of Africa are well mapped and represented. So only a fraction of those are really mapped and understood where they are. I know some of the authors have addressed those in Ethiopia, but we don't understand the pressures from whether it's climate change or even anthropogenic impacts on the systems and how fast they're changing. You know, for example, in the DRC also that whole system is a forested peatland and but the canopy and the tree species are different to those in South Africa. And again, accessibility is quite difficult. So in many parts of Africa, yes, there's also the local farming in peatlands, and it's considered, you know, viable areas for crop production. But we don't know if the water and even in the tropical areas are then managed better and less of a risk compared to what you have in South Africa as an arid to temperate region. So there's definitely a need for further work and research. And, so I know there's a lot of funding for African students to study abroad, but I hope that the passion would return in asking them to go and better sample and represent their work in Africa so that we can get a better idea of the African peatlands. And maybe just a last small note or two that I would want to add. So there's been some discussions, I can't remember which company is leading it, about whether we can do red listing of peatlands globally. And we participated in that webinar and workshop in order to start discussing, can you actually model different peatlands right across the globe? And again, the question is, when we do peatland characteristics and understanding them, it needs to be at a continental wide scale so that we understand which ones are really unique and range restricted, of which you then need to protect 30% of the extent for target 3 of the global biodiversity framework, or have 30% of the degraded areas under restoration by 2030 for the global biodiversity target 2. So there is quite a lot of work in that regard that's necessary. And then very recently in 2024, Zhang et al. Published the biodiversity types of wetlands right across the globe. So that becomes a valuable resource to also evaluate in Africa. Where do we have it? Maybe model the peat ecoregions for Africa to understand it, and then maybe just do a first level, even if it's a desktop level, of understanding the land use, land cover of those systems, and again package it within the context of the biodiversity types of these systems. So what the biodiversity types of the global wetland layer of Zhang et al. 2023 and 2024 papers are, is more based on vegetation cover. So they have distinguished the estuarine systems such as your mangrove, salt marshes, and then further inland, it's mainly your forested wetlands and marshlands that are distinguished. But that's still a very valuable resource. I have a paper in review where I've done a comparison to the National Wetland Map 6 of South Africa, which indicates that this global wetland layer is only representing less than 20% of the extent of what we've mapped in South Africa. So again, that shows you the big gap of how we really need to invest and understand the distribution, the representativity of the different biodiversity types of peatlands, and then also understand the impacts, and then understand where is it that we actually need to do what type of monitoring. Like you talking about the flux towers, for us in South Africa, that's a big challenge that people steal the materials. So it's sometimes very challenging to have that as a monitoring system, whereas one has to ask whether the space-borne remote sensing sensors are adequate in their spatial resolution and accuracy of the depths that they can monitor systems. So I know that's a big mouthful in answering your simple, one question, but I hope it enriches the discussion about what is it that we need to action in order to be able to answer that question and have the climate change understanding relative to what is a result as a result of anthropogenic impacts of the choices we do in land use, land cover. I hope that answers it, Felix.
Thank you, Heidi. Speaking of enriching the discussion, I want to ask the listeners, please ask your questions. We have some time left. Maybe one other quick question to you, Heidi. It's about, have you measured the SOC and the flux at the same time? It was about your presentation.
Yes, that is the one that I relayed to Jason, but I can see he's enjoying his fieldwork and not having connectivity. So I don't know if he's measured that in the field, but I doubt if he's measured it at Vazipan or Mfabeni, the other site. But what I will ask and chat with him is that when you release the YouTube video, that he responds in the chat to the YouTube video in answering those questions so that it's immediately responding to the YouTube video that people can pick up. Is that okay?
Yes, no problem at all. And here, one more question. Can New Zealand talk to the loss of methane satellite? could it have been useful for their research?
We were involved in that program, and one of the ideas was to see if we could. The original idea of methane sat was to look at plumes of methane coming from gas leaks, so really point source side of things. And New Zealand's objective was to look at whether we would be able to use the data from methane sat to also look at methane emissions associated with animals. And certainly wetlands were considered as well. Whether it could reach the sensitivity it needed for the sort of broad scale emissions that you get, which are relatively low on a per hectare basis relative to a leak in a gas pipe, we don't know. I think it might have been pushing the limits of that, but we don't know. Or I don't know.
All right, thank you. Another question to Heidi. How are peat fires monitored in South Africa? Is that ground-based or is it done with remote sensing? Are the corresponding emissions included in the national GHG inventory?
Very good questions. I think at the moment we are dependent on citizen science reporting little fires that they see. You know, we've been in the field also with in a Ramsar site where the guard or it's more a wetland specialist that's part of the conservation agency immediately pointed and said, there's a fire, one needs to report it. So there is an official number that one can dial to report a fire, and then it does action either the local community's fire team, or if it's a really big montane one, there's specialized teams from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment that can go up into the mountains and fight those fires. And obviously the helicopters and interventions that way. No, there's not remote sensing done for early detection and monitoring of it. We do have a national fire monitoring system that is up and running. It's a core scale 246 meters spatial resolution, so it won't detect very small systems. They don't really know where the peatlands are, so it is a possibility that one can actually, you know, bring that into the monitoring system. But the burnt area, and they monitor burnt area and active fires. So that active fires need to be larger than 246 by 246 meters before it will be detected and reported. So it's not sufficient. As I did mention, the thermal drone image that you can fly afterwards helps with intervention of where it would be safe. And good point about the emissions in the greenhouse gas inventory. I don't think that's been considered. You know, previously I have taken part in a greenhouse gas inventory where they just said, our wetlands are so small, they don't even make a big difference in our greenhouse gas inventory. But it is a very good point in question that we should start highlighting the fires. So I'll follow up with the team and hear if they have read the paper about the number of fires and their duration, and whether we can estimate, you know, any of the emissions that's associated with that, and bring that into the next one. Thank you for that suggestion.
All right, thank you. And I would say with this, we've answered all the questions. We have 2 more minutes, and therefore I think I would like to thank the audience for sticking till the end. I would like to thank the speakers for being here despite the terrible New Zealand working hours today. And thank you to Mark for handling all the Zoom things that needed handling. And I would say if there are not any more comments that want to be given, then I think we're good for today. And I would close the meeting with that. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.